University of Malta, and the Department of Maltese, obviously, my colleagues and friends, Professor Grima, Professor Kalef, Professor Mejju, and Professor Al-Awtur as well, who is somebody we know for a long time at the INALCO. That's for one. For second, I'd like to apologize in advance for the quality of my English. I used to speak it quite well, but unfortunately, time passing by, I lost it quite a lot. So from time to time, I hope I maybe try help. I ask you for some help in order to find the right word or the right expression. I would have loved to have my talk to give my talk in Maltese. Unfortunately, my Maltese is quite bad. Maybe as bad as my English. Otherwise, I could have made my talk in Arabic, Algerian. Maybe some of you could have at least understood some words, but obviously, I try my English anyway. So today, it's an honor for me, obviously, to begin this cycle of research on oral tradition with the project of, as Professor Grima told you just a few moments ago, with the project maybe trying to confront and associate the researches we are doing for the moment at Paris University and Vienna precisely, and what has already been done here. I know that a lot has already been done, obviously, by many scholars, very prestigious scholars, and what is planned to be done in the near future. But in fact, rather to just give you sort of a lecture, normal lecture, I'd rather take this opportunity, in fact, to discuss and debate with you, and most of all exchange with you, on the subject of oral tradition. And I'll have three main points, as you see. The first one will be a general overview on some very common concepts: orality, vocality, textuality, tradition, modernity. The second point would be more polemical. It's about the implication of ideology and maybe of politicalism in the scientific field, because obviously one cannot avoid this dimension. So but obviously I won't speak about that. I will speak about what I'm supposed to know a little better, which is the Maghreb context. And my third point will be on the Algerian experience, and more precisely on my modest experience through this huge poetical field which concerned women's urban poetries. I choose to begin by, obviously that was a problem, but anyway, I suppose maybe you'll be able to notice some details on these miniatures. I choose to begin my talk with a miniature, which may be something awkward, but why did I choose to begin with this? It's because, as you see, this miniature, in fact, depicts what is considered as a traditional interior, Moorish interior. And the miniature, in fact, is by a very famous Algerian miniaturist, whose name is Racine. And according to me, there are many features which I'm going to speak about in my talk. And one of the main features, according to me, is the use of stereotypes in this sort of idyllic representation of what is supposed to be the traditional culture of Algeria. Obviously, this is utopia, this is dream. it's a completely fantastic way of depicting the reality of the culture, especially during this period. We were during the colonial period, obviously, and this is completely fantastic view of what is supposed, as you see here, you have a woman playing a lute. You have, you see, this beautiful environment with gardens and, you know, traditional architecture. And in fact, this miniature is supposed to give you some basic information on, first, what is tradition, according to this miniaturist. What is the women's status within the society? You see, we are in a close environment, an interior. And we have, as well, the link with poetry, music, probably with a hint to the Andalusian sort of cultural atmosphere. And on the whole, according to my view, this miniature symbolizes in a very special way the link and the search for the tradition. What is tradition? And how is it possible to represent it? So we have, in a way, a sort of ideological framework on what is supposed to be tradition. So, first point, orality, locality, textuality, tradition, and modernity. First of all, how is it possible to define orality? You see, I choose three main points: orality, locality and writing, orality and performance, orality and rituals. First point, what is orality? Of course, orality is a concept which has so many definitions. But maybe one of the main features is that most of the time, orality is opposed to writing, obviously, which in fact is not evident, because it seems to me, and not only to me, that in fact we have two systems, orality and writing, which most of the time coexist and interfere in many different ways, according to various cultural areas, political and ideological systems or environments, and historical periods, obviously. For instance, one of the main figures in the field of oral tradition research, his name is Paul Zultor. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's very well known, at least in the French academic side. And Paul Zultor used to define three main types of orality. The primary orality, which is in fact linked to a society which is supposed to have never been in contact with writing. And that's, even this sort of view to me is maybe a little controversial, because what is writing after all? I mean, you can have some symbols or a symbolic system which has lost its original meaning, but which still exists in the environment, like in poetry or in, I don't know, rugs, tapestry or whatever. And one could easily say, well, this society has no writings. But it's not true, in fact. It has writing, but this, not the writing we are used to. I mean, you know, the system which has been defined according to the norms of the linguists. Then Zultor defined a second type of orality, which he calls mixed orality, which is in fact the situation where when society is in contact with some kind of writings, and when changes begin to occur within the two systems. And then we have a secondary orality, which is the kind of orality we have now, we experience now, which is the orality which implies technological improvements, a new system of communications, internet, TV, radio, and all that. But before passing to another point, I'd like to insist on something else which is rarely evoked when one speaks about orality. It's vocality. And vocality is a complex notion which has to do basically, according to progenitor as well, to the body. That is rhythm, sound. And as well to what I would call, but obviously the expression is a little awkward, archaeological or archetypal, archetypal memory. So, neo-archetypal. So, according to progenitor, it's a quotation. And progenitor was as well a medievalist and an oralist. According to him, quotation, the vocality is located between the body and the world, meaning both the impossibility of origin and the triumph of this impossibility. Because obviously vocality is the most profound, the deepest level of orality, and it has something to do with our origins. I mean, before Babel and before, the beginning of humanity. And we still, each of us still have this little tiny element which comes from so far in the past. So, for me that's important. Why? Because this vocality reminds us that whenever we deal with oral tradition, the body is implied, the rhythm is implied, pulsation is implied. So really, our discipline is something which needs really a pluridisciplinary approach, obviously. So, so back to a possible, what I would call a possible definition of orality. According to me, it's at the same time a medium, obviously, a medium which implies words, which implies sounds, which implies corporal memories and postures. And we know that these types of features are maybe the ones who, which stay the longer in terms of time, passing of time. The physical postures, it's something which is, I mean, everybody could notice it. I mean, when you see, when I see somebody walking in front of me, if it's of my own nation, of my own culture, I would recognize it at first, because there's a way of, of just, moving, occupying space. And that's very, very, this type of memory, of corporal memory, is something which is very, very ancient in the all tradition, all cultural tradition. So a medium, obviously a social practice, since it implies many actors and rules between actors. It's as well, orality, it's an institution which, with its own rules, and for instance, what about censorship? Obviously, whatever you talk about institution, you talk about authority, and obviously you would talk about what is good, what is wrong, what can say, and what cannot say, and in what circumstances you have to say or not to say. And
at last, orality implies what I would call an imaginaire in French, an imaginaire, a social, sorry? An imaginary world, if you want, yes. So, so medium, social practice, institution, imaginary world. But obviously, there's not only one definition of orality. There's so many, and one must bear in mind that there's not one orality, but many, and so many. So now I'll pass through some of the main figures according to my personal pantheon. Is it pantheon? Pantheon in French? Pantheon? Okay. In the field of research on oral tradition. And the first one is the man you see. Well, I suppose everybody would recognize him. It's Albert Lord, the author of The Singer of Tales, which has been so famous in his time and even in our days. So Albert Lord with Milman Parry was the two main figures of this research on Serbo-Croatian poetry and all the research on the relationships between what they called the formulaic method and the invention of the Odysseus, of the Odyssey. And they were maybe one of the first thinking and rethinking the opposition between oral and written composition. And I had here a quotation from Albert Lord in The Singer of Tales. Obviously, the quotation is applied to the subject, which was oral epic songs in late Yugoslavia. Narrative poetry composed in it. So, what is oral epic songs according to Lord? Narrative poetry composed in a manner evolved over many generations by singers of tales who did not know how to write, you see. It consists of the building of metrical lines and half lines by means of formulas and formulaic expressions, and the building of songs by the use of themes. So, you see, the important things obviously is the use of the formula as a way of transmitting and composing as well, both of them. So the second figure would be Havelock, obviously, Eric Havelock, for all his works on the transition between orality and writing, and especially among the ancient Greeks. And he was one of the scholars who, I think, thought about the necessity of taking into account the point that orality and writings are not two separate systems, but there was always, and even in the Greek times, there was sort of coexistence. Is it coexistence? Coexistence? Thank you. Then, third figure, Walter Ong, and his works on the two types of orality as well. So you see, this is the quotation I took. Logically, if the message is a song or verse song aloud, you don't see it. If, on the other hand, it is a written document, it can't sing to you. But the logic of either or does not belong in these words. They open a window on the cultural process of transition in which collision and contradiction are of this sense. The muse of orality, a singer, reciter, memorizer, is learning to read and write, but at the same time that she continues to sing. See, so there's, even in the writing, there's a memory of the orality which is still available and which one must take into account. Just a little detail. The works by Ong was an important contribution with regards to Marshall McLuhan's theory on the hegemony of writing and on print. He was the one who, introduced some nuance in the theories, important nuance in the theories of Marshall McLuhan. But what about the written as opposed to the spoken cultural production, and especially if we take into account their common features and interconnections. And I'm passing through, oh yeah, that's a quotation. I style the orality of a culture totally untouched by any knowledge of writing or print, primary orality. It is primary by contrast with the secondary orality of present-day high-technology culture, in which a new orality is sustained by telephone, radio, television, and other electronic devices that depends for their existence and functioning on writing and print. Today, primary oral culture, in the strict sense, hardly exists, since every culture knows of writing and has some experience of its effect. So you see, taking into account the new technologies seems something very important, and I'll speak about it later on in my talk. So now I pass on to textuality. What is textuality? And for this point, I will rely essentially on Roland Barthes' theory, which is, as you may know, inspired by his interpretation of structuralism. And so all the research made by Roland Barthes was about the status of literature. What is literature, after all? And why are we so keen on separating always literature from non-literature, literature from oral literature? Where do this type of distinctions came from, in fact? And I used to say to my students when I introduce the theory by Roland Barthes about a kind of joke on Roland Barthes himself quotes in some of his books. One day, a journalist came to him and asked him, he was already, you know, sort of patriarch of the structuralism, the French structuralism. So she was very impressed. So she told him, well, Professor, how would you define literature? And she was expecting from him to see something very complicated. And he looked at her and said, well, literature is something which is taught. That's only that. And when you think about it, something which is taught, enseigné. La littérature, c'est ce qui s'enseigne. And when you think about it, I think it's maybe one of the best definitions of literature I've ever heard. Because after all, the notion we acquire about what is literature, we acquired them through education. And obviously, our view upon what is literature, what is orality, what is good, what is bad, what is inferior, what is superior, comes from our education. And that is from the manuals we are reading when we are young, from our professors, even I mean, so I do assume my position. So you see, so starting from this, in fact, Roland Barthes, well, developed his thinking, and first of all, he he opposed text and work. In French, l'œuvre. Le texte et l'œuvre. And for him, obviously, work, the notion of work, is associated with the classical view upon literature. That is, you have, when you speak about literature, you have the author, you have the reader, you have the chef-d'œuvre, you have the genius, you see all this kind of romantic theory about literature, which developed quite lately, and we are still using now, without maybe, having conscious of this. So, whereas according to Barthes, text is something completely different. First of all, and that's why the text excludes from the beginning the notion of author. There's no author. A text has no author, and we'll see why later on. And second, the text is a construction. It's not something you acquire. Ce n'est pas un donné. It's something which you elaborate through reading. And in a way, the author is a co-author. Each time you're reading a book, in fact, you're rewriting the book. So I think that's, and most of all, textuality means inter or transtextuality. That means that nobody can assume that this text is the first in the genealogy of the history of literature. There's no origin, to be quite simple, you see? So, that's, oh yeah. So this is a quotation of Barthes through a translation in English. A text is made from multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation, but there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as hitherto said, the author. The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up the writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. The text unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. I mean, that's the formula Barthes used to love. The death of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. That means that, in fact, there's reading and writing or composing is a never-ending process throughout humanity. So where, in that case, obviously I'm talking in a very theoretical way. Don't be afraid, I'm going to be more practical later on. But for the moment, one can imagine that, in fact, there's no origin, no end, until, well, one day maybe, the sun is going to explode and everything will be, obviously. But otherwise, we can imagine that, in fact, we are in a very huge system which has something to do with what Borges used to call the Babel library, where, you see, a quotation responds to another, whatever medium is used, I mean, orality, scripturality, whatever. So you can have in a very contemporary text reminiscence, okay, from something which used to be said by, I don't know, people from an Indian tribe, well, maybe 1,000 years ago, and you don't know that this is the evidence, but it is there. And somebody who is very, curious could maybe detect it. So, yes. So, according to Barthes, one more reason to try and understand the oral writing opposition and to understand that it's, according to Barthes, it's irrelevant, is that this ancient system, the classical system, would sort of, what's the English for verrouiller, to close? To close under lock and key. Yeah. Yes. To close under? Lock and key. Okay. Well, verrouiller, fermer. Okay. In French, verrouiller is much harder than fermer. So, yes, to close definitely the whole system and prevent it from outside influences. In a way, it's a, sorry, I'm going to be a little maybe too enthusiastic, but I'm going to use a quite severe word. It's the traditional classical system would be, in a way, a little racist, since it excludes things. You know, it's a very conservative system, whereas the system of Barthes is much open, completely open, in fact, you see. And, in fact, according to, why am I very interested in this theory? It's because we have the notion of a cultural continuum, socially governed, managed by some kinds of authorities, whatever authorities it is. It could be government authorities, could be the chief authorities, the shaman authorities, the tradition, which is, in a way, an authority. And that leads me to the next point, which is tradition. What is tradition? So, once more, sorry, I'll be very simple, because obviously it's an enormous concept. which would be completely stupid to me to try and define it, but I'll give some hints. The thing is, the first point is that obviously tradition is opposed to, usually is opposed to modernity. So one must define what we understand by tradition, what we understand by modernity. I'll come to it later on. But maybe there's two main aspects, according to me. The first one about tradition. The first one, it's tradition means transmission. Transmission of something, of cultural practices, transmission of repertoires, transmissions of value, whatever. And something which is very important and which is linked with transmission is the concept of loss. And that's something we experience quite a lot in Algeria and Maghreb, you see. It happens to me very frequently when I speak to my colleagues. They used to complain, even crying, say, well, oh, what a pity. This thing is completely disappeared. We have lost it. You see, this, what I used to call the syndrome, syndrome? Is it, syndrome? Syndrome? Syndrome, oh yes, okay, great. So the syndrome of the loss, the loss syndrome, le syndrome de la perte. And it's something which is very, according to me, very dangerous because it prevents us from seeing the dynamics of the system, you see, and become very, you see, conservative. And without realizing that, in fact, there's never been a tradition, in fact. Somebody, in fact, where is it? I think it's, oh, I lost it anyway. I'll find it. Oh, yes. It's Octavio Paz, the great poet and writer, Mexican poet and writer. Once put it like that way, the modern the modern is self-sufficient. Every time it appears, it creates its own tradition. See, so what about tradition? I mean, it's just the way one decides that I'm going to take this period as a model, you see? And that's the problem, because when you're talking about tradition, you introduce the term of model. But there's no model anyway. I mean, from the beginning, insofar as there's the beginning, well, there's never been, the model it's transitory. It's never something which is supposed to stay, I mean. Well, anyway. The second point about transition, is regulation. When you talk about tradition, you inevitably have in mind the concept of regulation, which means you need to define the type of authority which is supposed to get involved in the process of regulation. And that means that you'll have to deal with censorship. Who is the responsible? Which instance is responsible for for applying censorship, which leads us inevitably to the political dimension. So one must bear in mind that each time when you deal with poetics, you deal with politics as well, in a way or another. Anyway, so. This is Paul Zumthor, who wrote a lot on tradition, and that's one of the quotation from one of his main book, maybe the most famous, Introduction to Oral Poetry. In fact, it is quite easy to circumscribe traditions, in plural, much less to define the tradition. I consider rather here from far enough and high enough the thickness, you see, the thickness of social time, which more or less at any time, at any moment of time, tends to neutralize the contradictions between the present and the past, or the present and the future. You see, so in a way, tradition is just the level in which, in a certain period, un temps T, a tea time, not tea time, un temps T, as we say in French, the initial for time, T. So in a certain period of time, there will be a certain amount of rules accommodation, a system of mutual neutralization which would render the society able to assume its own contradiction in a way. So it's something a little bit complicated, I must agree. So the second figure I really, who for me is somebody really, one of the main figure on this matters, it's Michel de Certeau. Michel de Certeau wrote on tradition, on history, and the way the historians handle the concepts of memory. And he had a theory on what he called poaching. It's le bricolage, poaching, or the braconnage, as one of the many aspects of social tricks practiced by the dominated. So les ruses sociales, the social tricks which are used by the dominated to try and find their way through the laws or the application of the laws of the system of hegemony. So, what about modernity? So, once more, something very, very complicated to define. But one must take it into account because obviously tradition is most of the time opposed to modernity. Modernity is often looked upon in terms of rupture, of crisis, within the historical framework of the Western world development, obviously. And one of the main figures, obviously, is Baudelaire, as you may know, because he was one of the men, or one of those who invented or created the world, always, although the world did exist before him. But he was the one who really gave him its modern acceptation. And as you see, in one of his articles on the painter of modern life, published in 1863, he says, modernity is the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent. Modernité, c'est le transitoire, le fugitif, le contingent. Obviously, this kind of approach is typical from what we would call the modern Western world. It's not the case in other parts of the world, obviously. For instance, the Arab world doesn't think, and maybe it's one of the problems, it doesn't think of modernity as ruptures. We don't accept, or usually, the concept of ruptures, or even crisis, well, moreover. But rupture is something which never, with difficulty, think about. So modernity, according to Baudelaire and to this kind of thinking, would get us back to the Enlightenment, les Lumières, and the break with the feudal period. But obviously, there are many ways of defining modernity. And for instance, if we take one of the main figures of Arab poetry, and he is as well a thinker, and I think everybody knows Adonis. This is a quotation from one of these books, الثابت والمتحول, which means the static and the dynamic. What we must criticize firstly is how we define, it means the Arabs, we define heritage itself. In addition to the vagueness of the concept, prevalent conformist thought defines heritage as an essence or an origin to all subsequent cultural production. In my opinion, we must view heritage from the prism of cultural and social struggles that formed the Arabs' history, and when we do, it becomes erroneous to state that there is one Arabic heritage. Rather, there is a specific cultural product related to a specific order in a specific period of history. What we call heritage is nothing but a myriad of cultural and historical products that are at times even antithetic. As we see, Adonis here is in a way relating the notion of heritage to métissage, which is something quite daring in the Arab classical way of thinking about culture and heritage. So let's pass on to my second point. I don't know. Yeah. What about the situation in the Maghreb region now? I'll take three main periods in order to ask some crucial questions. First of all, what do we know exactly about oral tradition in North Africa, after all? What are the sources, and what are their values, and what is the context? What are the contexts in which they were transmitted and studied? How do we, and by we I mean the Maghrebi societies, consider this cultural process? And I'll take three main periods. The first one will be the medieval period, because obviously I could have started earlier, but the main factor which occurred in the Maghrebi region, obviously, was the Arab conquest. Whereas, well, still, the Roman conquest was something which was very, very important for us. Unfortunately, it is part of the problem because, for instance, the culture, the Roman heritage in Algeria is, as somebody here is very well placed to know, is something which is still denied in a way. That's very curious. Well, I used to talk to my students when I was in Algeria. I used to say to them, well, you know, you're talking about the Roman circus or Roman ruins, as if those ruins has been built by extraterrestrial, somebody coming from Sirius or from Mars. Those people who built those ruins are your grandfathers. They were Berbers. So you see, it's a this is one of the problems we have in Algeria with our history. So insofar as, that's the reason why I decided to start from the medieval period. And well, starting from this period, we already have problems because we have very, very few evidences or documents about what was the oral tradition or the literary tradition by that time. One of the main figures, obviously, would be Ibn Khaldun in that case. And Ibn Khaldun, his masterpiece, the Muqaddimah, obviously. Since it is in the Muqaddimah that maybe one could find the most important, the most significant evidences about how things began insofar as literature is concerned. And what Ibn Khaldun says to us is that, in fact, from the very beginning, the literary phenomenon began in the cities. And the cities were the main place where occurred the métissage, the cultural métissage between the Berbers tradition and the Arabs, or Arab tradition. So that's very important for us. Why? Because it's the first evidence we have dealing with the way the literary fields began to emerge and to structure themselves in Algeria. So, but it's quite, well, a few pages. I mean, and even those pages, in fact, are a little controversial because, as you may know, we have several versions of the Muqaddimah. And the last one, the last version of the Muqaddimah, has no more those 60 pages which are so important to us. As if either Ibn Khaldun decided to get rid of them for a reason we don't know, or maybe that could mean that those 60 pages were not really from him, maybe from a copyist or something. So there's a problem, even when one talks about the Muqaddimah. But anyway, whoever wrote those 60 pages, Ibn Khaldun or copyist, it gets us precious information about what occurred in the region of the 12th, 13th, 14th century, roughly speaking. So then we pass on to the colonial period. And as far as the colonial period is concerned, it's the reverse. We have, whereas in the medieval period, for the medieval period, we have very little documentation. For the colonial period, we have very rich and extensive documentation, thanks to the French or German or whatever scholars who happen to stay or to pass to have a trip in the region. I'm thinking obviously about Stumme, for instance. But the man you see on the picture, very honorable, with the big bird, you see this. He is one of the main figure of the dialectology field dealing with the Maghreb. It's William Marsay. And it happens that William Marsay was the first to speak and to give some evidence on the type of women poetry I'm dealing with. That's why he's so important for me as well. So in 1902, he published his books on the dialecte arabe par la Tlemcen, and there was a little corpus on the feminine poetry. But it was not the only one. I mean, there was plenty of them. And as well, there were plenty of amateur societies, publications of all sorts. You see, in the public library, in the National Library, sorry, in Paris, you have, well, I mean, you have kilometers of archives, you see, which are really of precious documentation to us. But obviously, there's a bias, un biais. Yeah, there's a bias. Why? Because obviously, but in a way, it's the same situation as for Ibn Khaldun, because obviously when Ibn Khaldun was writing his Muqaddimah, he was in a way defending, taking position as a Maghrebian against what was already considered by the academics of that times as a subculture, you see. So it was already on the part of Ibn Khaldun a sort of ideological standpoint. The same thing would apply to the colonial period, because obviously the work by Marsay or by Desparmes or by, anyway, those people who were really involved in the subject, the bias is either scientifically or ideologically oriented. Scientifically, why? Because all these corpus they are giving to us, they consider them only from the linguistic point of view, and never as from the aesthetic point of view, as a piece of literature. They consider them as document rather than as a piece of poetry or of literature. That's for one. A second, obviously, there's the ideological bias, since it's what obviously Marsay and the others belonged to what the French historians used to call the colonial science, la science coloniale, and that's for sure. But are we obliged to put them away and to consider that all these works which has been done, well, is nothing for us, doesn't concern us? That would be, for me, it would be a great fault. I mean, it's something which is completely stupid. But it is something that occurred to the mind of some of our politicians once. That's why I'm taking position very strongly against it. So, in the same period, for instance, we had already some indigenous intellectuals who began on their own to try and take position in the field of the popular tradition and oral cultures. One of them was Mustafa al-Ashraf, who used to be at the same time a politician he was very implied during the Liberation War, but he was as well an intellectual and a writer. And he was one of the first to deal with, for instance, a very huge repertoire we used to call the Melhoun, which is the popular men repertoires in the Maghreb. And he even he even devoted himself to some aspects of the feminine poetry in dialectal Arabic, sorry. I'm now coming to the, Frantz Fanon is as well a figure of the colonial period and the post-colonial period. Colonial period because obviously he was one of those who took position with the liberation movement in Algeria. As you know, he was a psychiatrist, and he joined the fight for the independence alongside with the FLN. But he was as well the one who, in a way, structured the way the post-colonial state would handle the problem of popular culture. So that's why he belongs to the both period. So this is one of the quotation, very famous, from The Wretched of the Earth. And you will see what I mean when I'm talking about this man belonging to the two periods. The national culture is not a folklore, not an abstract populism that believes it can discover the people's true nature. It is not made up of the inner dregs of gratuitous actions, that is to say, actions which are less and less attached to the ever-present reality of the people. A national culture is the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence. You see, so obviously one of the main concern of Fanon was to define national culture and to try and give some evidence about what it should be in the future. And as you see, the opposition is very, very clear between what he calls folklore, which he assimilated to the kind of rigid memory, something which is dead in the memory of the people, and the other part of this common memory, which is still active and which is directly influenced by the struggle. So it's, I would say, it's a kind of very engaged definition of culture and obviously of national culture. And what Fanon tried to do is to make us aware of the dynamic changes which occurred in the cultural field in Algeria during the Liberation War. And this type of thinking influenced to a large extent the way the Algerian state handled the question of the definition of oral and popular culture. So I'm coming to the post-colonial period, and since this post-colonial period has direct link with my personal experience, I will only, as an introduction, just underline some important points. First of all, there's a contradiction, there's a paradox between what we have just heard from Fanon, on the one hand, that is to say, taking into account the very roots, the cultural roots of the Algerian people, and on the other hand, the type of politics or political measures the Algerian government took after the independence. I must remind you, by the way, that the official title of our republic, as you may read it in front of all the, the public buildings, is الجمهورية الجزائرية الديمقراطية الشعبية, means the Algerian Republic, democratic and popular. And the term popular is very important. But since, well, when one looks closely to the reality, in fact, for more than, I would say, nearly 20 years after the independence, this dimension was not really taken into account by the officials. And that's very striking. There was, on the one hand, the official discourse during the meetings, the political meeting and all that, you see, all the publication, the newspapers, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the official practices, or the real practice. And in fact, it looks like popular culture, oral culture, was lacking legitimacy in the eye of the officials. And one of the way one can, check this assessment is only to look the way popular culture, oral traditions were taught. For instance, at the primary schools, at the secondary schools, even at the university. We waited maybe 20 years before we had the government finally accepted to open one institute for popular culture. And that was after what we used to call in Algeria the Berber Spring, le printemps berbère, in the early 80s. And it was because those events, political events, were so serious that the government felt obliged to, to concede, to react. So he accepted at last to open one small department with, something very ridiculous, in fact. And that, to me, it's really striking. And I did this experience because when I decided, and I'm coming to my modest experience, if you don't mind, when I first decided to involve myself in this particular field, it was something completely surrealist, as we say in French. C'est complètement surréaliste. In fact, I had to face so many difficulties. The first one because obviously there was no training. There was I hadn't been trained for this particular field. I did a licence in literature and in linguistics as well. Well, it may be funny, but that was the case. But how to handle a fairy tale, how to handle a proverb, how to handle, I had no training at all. And that's the reason why, by the way, I went to SOAS. But unfortunately, I had some problems with the administration because they were I was struggling for 2 years in order to convince them that I was not supposed to pass an exam in classical, medieval history of literature, of Arab literature, because obviously all this kind of things had nothing to do with my own subject. So I struggled desperately in order to try and convince them, and finally they didn't agree, so I had to go to Paris, where I get in touch with late Germaine Tillon, and then with David Cohen, who was my supervisor. So the first point, you see, the first problem I had was the training, lack of training. The second was the way the administration, my colleagues, my fellows around me, even my own family, were looking at me. They was thinking I was completely crazy, because by that time, I was the only one in my field. Everybody was, just decided to go to study economics, or I don't know, petrochemie. It was very trendy by that time. Yeah. But what about oral tradition? Nothing. Then I had as well a big problem, because at first I had the intention to work on a corpus of tales of Jaha. Les contes de Jaha tales. Jaha. Yeah, we have I know, you have the same in Malta. So, but once I happened to discuss with my father, who used to work a little bit in this field, and he told me, well, you see, that's too huge for you. You are going to lose completely yourself. So why don't you try yourself in something quite small. That's the best way to try and, improve yourself and test your method. And I answered him back, well, what you're thinking of? Why not Haufi? It's a repertoire, You've heard your grandmother, your aunts, they used to sing it. It's something very small, it's just quatrains. It's in Tlemcen, which is a very small city. So, well, you won't have any kind of difficulty to work on this type of field. So I agreed. And I began to start collecting. But pretty soon it appeared that I had to face many difficulties. And the first one would be, obviously, because I was a man. So how to collect a typical women's song when you're a man, especially in a very traditional society, it's not very, very easy. So, well, I tried to find tricky ways, trying to imply some of my relatives, well, I managed to at least to gather more than 500 poems after 2 or 3 years of collecting. And then, I decided to go to Great Britain, where I had those problems. So I went back to Paris, and the same happened to me. I mean, even in France, the studies in the field of oral literature was not very developed by that time. For instance, I remember Germaine Tillon, who became a very well-known specialist in this field, was still, she was dirigée, she was directing a very small team of 2 or 3 people who later on became my colleagues, and they used to publish a sort of leaflet, small leaflet, which was called the Bulletin des études orales, which had maybe, maybe 10 or 15 pages, only that, you see. So even in France, by that time, it was not really something which is common. So I had many difficulties to try and, find my own way inside this context. And then, the first book I wrote was this one, which is out of Seoul now, which is, in fact, the title would be in English, The Haufi, Women's Poetry and Oral Tradition in the Maghreb, in 1986. It was a rewriting from my thesis, obviously. And the second one, later on, was this one, which could be translated as Genesis Mirrors, les miroirs de Janus, Oral Literatures and Post-Colonial Writings. That was in 2002. Why do I make a link between both publications? Because time passing, I realized that there was, as I have tried to demonstrate in my talk, there was close link between what would be oral tradition and what has appeared in the recent period as written literature, novel, short stories, or whatever. So the idea, in my mind, was to give a comprehensive approach to the phenomenon or to the literary fields in Algeria as a continuum, and not as separate periods, separate domains, and all that. So. 3 points as well. What about documenting and collecting? So I already talked a little bit about it. Beginning the research in the early 70s, very few documentation. Why? Because I had to deal with a feminine, oral, vernacular, popular repertoire. That is to say, it's a desperate situation. Desperate why? Because, first of all, it's a feminine. And we have, if we already lack documentation about men's popular literature, what about women's? It's even worse. I mean, we have practically no evidence about the history of what would have been the tradition in the feminine field. Second, oral. Obviously, that refers to what I said later on, after that, a few moments ago, about the hierarchy between oral and written. You see, oral is considered as subculture, so it's not valuable. Vernacular, that's it's a point obviously a lot of people here can understand. That means what is the status of the dialectal Arabic with comparison with the classical one? And one is this point is really crucial to me. And it's one of the main struggles we are now facing in Algeria. How to regain, to give people some confidence about what the kind of language they're speaking. It's something completely crazy. People are talking, people are thinking in a language they consider as a sub-language. That makes people crazy. I mean, it's kind of schizophrenia, is it? Schizophrenia? That's exactly the thing. So, and last but not least, popular. And that leads us back to the status of the popular with comparison with the classical. For instance, one joke, you see, we have one of the cultural reference in music and poetry in Algeria is the one we are supposed to have received from Andalusia. And so it is constituted by, it's composed of several repertoires which are, situated in either Constantine or Algiers, capital town, or in Tlemcen. Well, they're scattered all over Algeria, in the old cities, obviously, not in the countryside. And these repertoires, in fact, has many names. You can call it Sana'a, you can call it Malouf, you can call it Ala, depends on whether you're talking about Morocco, Algeria, or whatever. But, listen to me, the Algerian authorities decided to create a concept. And they used to call it, and it's still the case for the moment, they call it الموسيقى الكلاسيكية الجزائرية. That means the classical Algerian music. This concept of classical never existed in the dictionaries of the Algerian. I mean, it is borrowed from outside, where it has a completely different meaning. I mean, classical, I know what is classical. I suppose to know what is classical music. I'm talking about Bach or Beethoven or whatever, Vivaldi. Well, that's classical music. But what's the link between classical music and Sana'a or Malouf or whatever? You see, it's just because the ideological system needed a reference, a valuable reference. That you see. So in the one hand we had classical music, classical Algerian music, and the other hand, what about the popular culture? Nothing. So now, main features of this genre I'm dealing with. So maybe a map will help a little bit. You see, I'm talking about this red little square on the left of the map. You see, this one, Tlemcen. See, this was my first terrain, field research. So the repertoire I'm talking about, or the genre I'm talking about, is, in fact, and it was something I discovered later on. Obviously, well, I'm very, very happy now, but if I had think at first that I would have been, obliged to handle such a huge repertoire, I think I would have been afraid, and maybe I would have, stopped my thesis. Because the more I was getting, collecting text, and the more I realized that, in fact, this repertoire, which we used to call Haufi in Tlemcen, had in fact different versions outside Tlemcen. And for instance, in Algiers, the capital town, for instance, in Ténès, which is this little city over there, and not only in Algeria, but later on I discovered that there was as well versions in Morocco, for instance, in Fes, in Rabat, in Sela. They call it al-Arubiyat, which is because there's feminine Arubiyat and masculine Arubiyat. And in Morocco, they call them Arubiyat. We have evidence, thanks to Sturm, of some poems of the same time in Tunisia. And just lately, a young student of mine, a Libyan one, told me that there was exactly the same text in Tripoli. And they call them Bugala, whereas in Algiers they call them Bukala. See, it's just a question of pronunciation. So we have, you see, we have what I used to call a pan-Maghrebian repertoire. It's no more Tlemcen. It's just, you see, a very huge repertoires with maybe hundreds and hundreds of poems. So it's not a small repertoire. First. Second, it's very ancient repertoire. There's evidence that one can imagine that it emerged maybe around the 9th or 10th century, with Berber's influence, obviously, as well, and in connection with Andalus as well. So it works on both sides of the Mediterranean. We have as well the problem of the rights, the social rights and social practices. Those repertoires are linked with, because they are linked with social repertoires. For instance, we have Al-Hawfi, which is linked with, depends on the season. It can be the washing by the women, where they go during the spring period, they wash at the river, and they used to sing this type of poetry. Or you have as well the practice of the bundle, is it? The swing, of the swing, okay? We have it, yes, in Tlemcen is very famous. In proximity with the saints' tombs, the pilgrimage, when the women used to go to pilgrimage, they used to sing it as well. But there's as well some other evidence. Insofar as the Bukala version is concerned, it's linked with a ritual of divination. Sorry? No, not really fortune telling, no. To deviner. Sorry? To foretell. Exactly, to foretell, exactly. Prévoir, c'est deviner. Well, and so on and so on. So you see, it seems that this type of repertoires went through many transformations throughout the times, transformations in terms of functions, and even transformations, in terms of audiences. Because one may think that in one period of time, this type of repertoires may have concerned men. And then afterwards, the men would have get rid of it. And this repertoire would have been taken by women. Or maybe there was even a period when both of them were, because obviously those repertoires are used either inside the door, inside the house, inside the house, so everybody can listen to them, even the youngsters or the children and the men. So this repertoire are known either by men or by women. They practice probably used to be maybe a period where they were practiced by both. Then another specificity of this repertoire is the fact that The Hawfi, for instance, is sung, whereas the Buqala is never sung, just recited. So you see, we have as well this problem of what is it that at first the repertoire was already sung, or was it later on that part of it would have been sung by some women? One can't really say. Well, now I'm going to give you some, oh yes, that's a general view of Tlemcen, you see, by the time of the French conquest. So that's one of the first examples I'll give you. So maybe I'll say it in Arabic, maybe in my Algerian Arabic. أنا جالسة في الرياض باللوز نتدرق وفات عليا شباب في يده قضيب زرق شيشيته معنقرة تحفيفته تبرق وعليه نرمي الأولاد وعليه نطلق وعليه نخلي البلاد ونردها فندق. So the translation would be, I was sitting in the garden, hiding by an almond tree, and a young man passed me by, and in his hand a blue staff. His shashia, which is a traditional hat, slanted back. His pate glitters, and for him I would throw away my children, and for him get divorced, and for him ruin the town and turn it into a funduk. Well, in fact, funduk is a traditional inn, but in this context means chaos, something chaotic. See, so you see the power of love. Well, another example. Oh, I love this one. العشق في ديارنا والعشق ربانا والعشق في بيرنا حتى حلمنا والعشق في داليا حتى رمات الغصان والعشق ما ينكره لا أمير ولا سلطان. Love is in our houses, and love has educated us. Love is in our wells, and our water has become sweet. Love is in the vine, and it has spread its twig. Love, nobody can deny it, whether an emir or a sultan. Another example, بنتي في جغليلة قرطانها عكري ارسلوا البن عمها يجري على بكري يعطي 100% والجوهر الحلبي يعطي 100% والخادم دي تربي. The tradition, my daughter is playing in the swing, and her kaftan is purple red. Kaftan is part of the traditional women habit. Tell her cousin, and it means the cousin from the paternal side, to hasten and come early. He must give hundreds and hundreds of golden coins, obviously, and pearls from Aleppo. He must give hundreds and hundreds, and the servant who will raise the children. It's ditrabbi. Alors, now I'm going to maybe to the most important point of my talk, and you are going to understand why. And that's a special thanks to my colleague and friend, Manuel. Well, I would dare to try and pronounce the Maltese text, but anyway, my mother made me a swing tied to the branch of the almond tree. What a shock I felt in my heart because my darling gave me a kiss. I mean, when I read it, I was completely, well, in a way, surprised, but not that much, because it has always been I was completely convinced that there must be parallelism, or even maybe a very, very close link between the kind of poetry I'm working on and the Maltese feminine repertoires. That's for sure. And that's one of the proof for me. But what surprises me is that the fact that when I asked many of my colleagues about this tradition of the bandla, I didn't get the right answer. I remember I was very little disappointed. But that's a proof that, in fact, we have practically the same practice. So, sorry. So what's next? What's next? That's what's next. You have now, the new technology, and the way those very old poems are now entering the fields of internet and all the new media. For instance, this is one of the many, many, many internet sites on the Bukala game and poetry, for instance, but there are many, many of them. See, Bukala Algéroise, skyblog.com. Bon. That's another, well, that's a blog, I suppose, from somebody. It's in fact, you see, that's a picture. That's a text. Well, I'll give you straight away the introduction. I went up to the terrace. I said to my beloved, beware if you would forget me. Oh, you who occupies my mind, your love is in my heart like real pearls. That's another one, which is very funny. Traditional Bukala on the internet, you see. Donc, this one means I went down to the seashore and put a mat on the sand. I sat down and stretched my legs. A young man passed me by and he stared at me. I said to him, oh, young man, why are you staring at me? He answered, my treasures, my riches, my heart are yours. And you are my lawful bride in this lifetime. See, that's it. Well, that's another one. إلا أنت بحر أنا حوتة فيك وإلا أنت جنان أنا وردة فيك وإلا أنت تحبني أنا نموت عليك. Well, I think everybody has understood. Well, that's why I didn't translate it. So that's a broadcast program on an Algerian broadcasting program which is called Radio Basma, and that's about Bukalat. You see, always the same repertoire. That's a TV program on Bukala. That's the first part of it. Aqd Winwi, that's part of the ritual. And then you have this woman, those two young women who are in fact reciting the poetry. And last, even on advertising, for instance, one of the main Algerian mobile operator decided to, to promote the way of exchanging SMS. And in fact, they exchange Bukalat through SMS, especially during the Ramadan period, which are now coming. Well, I hope I wasn't too long and not too confused. And I thank you for your attention. And Grazie Hafna.
This is sort of the end of the first part, but before we end this public talk, I'd like to ask you whether you have any questions or comments for Professor Yelles. So we can take some questions or comments. Juicy? We always need the mic for recording.
This Hawfi, does it have a consistent form as regarding the syllables of the lines, for example?
That's a very good question and very complicated as well. In fact, there's been at least 3 or 4 theories insofar as the metrical aspect is concerned, because I think that's what you were meaning. But the problem is how to define the syllable in dialectal Arabic. And that's one of the main points we have, the main problem. Because it seems that, especially in poetry, one can't speak about the short or long syllable. There must be another, well, according to, I'm thinking about one of our main Algerian scholar, Ahmed Tahar, who produced a huge thesis about it. And he discovered, according to him, that one must take into account a special kind of syllable, which would be the surlong, called la surlongue, which is not the long, not the brief, it's the surlong. And if you introduce the surlong, you can apply the syllabic scheme. But obviously, there is a metrical pattern, obviously. Even for to memorize the rhyme, you must have a sort of rhythm, obviously. And even a rhyme, a final rhyme, obviously.
Thank you very much. I'm very curious about the form of interaction which takes place between the two female, or how many female singers, in the cases where the Hawfi is sung, right? Is there a form of answer? Do they tease each other? Do they verbally attack each other? Like in Maltesana, sometimes it happens that the women tease each other about their husbands, or they used to boast about their respective lovers. And did it happen in Haufi as well, or was it totally different? And what's the fact that maybe women were more confined to the house? What sort of effect did it have on the content of the verses that they used to sing?
Well, I think, according to my knowledge, but obviously I'm talking about the period I was collecting it and the way I could assume that things were effectively occurring. You have some situation where the two women exchange. Yes, I have some text clearly. You have the first text and then the second, which is an answer to the first. But most of the time, it's not the case. Although, since we deal with very metaphorical poetry, it's very easy to, in fact, to combine, to take some verse from one Haufi, to include it to another one, and to use it in a very special occasion. So one must not exclude the possibility that, well, although you don't have a particular answer or a direct answer, you have an indirect answer. You see, I don't know whether I'm clear enough.
There was a kind of sous-entendre.
Yes, in a way, through the way of combining, verses extracted from other texts, in fact.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I'm interested in the fact of when the Haufi actually came onto the social media. Did the nature of the poetry change in the sense, did we start having political attacks? Because in Tunisia, for example, when there were a lot of jokes on the social media about the politicians after the revolution. So I was just wondering if there was this comparison, even though there is a different political situation.
Yeah. No, well, different situation. Well, depends on the way you look at it. Anyway, but it's very diplomatic kind of issues. No, in fact, we are dealing with a repertoire which is not as malleable, as ductile as the one you're talking about. In fact, first of all, tradition of the Haufi itself has evolved, but curiously through music. That's a very funny thing, because in fact it happened that by the early 30s, one of the main figures of the musical field in Tlemcen, he was a sheikh, which is Mejju, so really the master of the music, traditional music, Andalusian music, decided one day that in order, because he was aware that there was a change in the taste, the public taste. So he felt the necessity to try and give some légèreté, lightness to this very solemn nuba way of playing music. So he decided to introduce the nuba, which is a kind of sinfonia. Sorry?
It's a song set.
Yes, with several movements. So he decided to try and introduce it through the Haufi. And it was the first time that ever occurred this type of situation. How you can imagine a very classical repertoire which is introduced by women poetry, and it worked. It worked. And it worked so well that nowadays it's considered as something very usual. Whereas it just occurred that, well, at least 9 years, less than a century ago. So you see the changes are very quick. And it's this type of evolution
rhythmic, just vocal.
Mostly emotional.
Yeah, mostly emotional. Yes, exactly. Or tempo. So there's no theory. And that's rather bad.
Are Hawfis still produced nowadays, or are they considered as a traditional genre? Because in Malta, we tend to distinguish between the two. The spiritu pront, which consists in answers. Yes, improvised poetry, and on the other hand, we have a large repertoire of traditional, and I think that is not produced anymore now. They are just traditional quatrains, and I don't know where you would place Hawfi in this.
I think I would rather go for the second solution, I'm afraid. It's that, in fact, I think that there's no more creation of Hawfi. But still, when you have at least 500 or 600 distinct poem text, you can always, just borrow a verse and compose a new Hawfi, which looks like a new. That's the problem.
Yes, in fact, sometimes answer each other using the system you gave.
That's exactly the case
You mentioned in your answer to me.
That's exactly the case for some.
So using traditional quatrains on the same theme.
Are they on the same theme?
No. You could set up a sort of long poem, which is made up of separate quatrains.
It's like Lego.
But on the same
Exactly like Lego. That's the formulaic system. That's the great advantage.
Excuse my ignorance, are these sung mainly by older women or by everyone? Young women?
That's a very interesting question. Well, it depends. It depends on the Hawfi. Some of them, for instance, the one which I quoted just a few minutes ago about this woman telling that for the love of her beloved, she would ruin the city and she get rid of its children. Obviously, an old woman wouldn't sing it, openly, obviously. my own grandmother, she was very confused, when she had to sing it. I remember that very well, because obviously it doesn't coincide with the normal values, you see. So, it depends on the person you are dealing with, obviously. But, well, yes, I think it's... I don't know whether I answered your question correctly. I'm afraid not.
Yes, no. Who sings that predominantly? Are they sung at school? Are they sung in communities?
Definitely no.
Among the older adults? Or
Not at school. No.
In private spaces.
Either in private spaces, at home, or during the washing session, let's call them that place, at spring, during the spring period, or during the pilgrimages to the saint tombs. But they can be sung either by young women or by elder women. Depends on, once more, depends on the type of poems you have in mind.
In the case where you have content that is controversial in religious terms, like there is a strong content which refers to infidelity, which I think in the official religion of the country would be punished by death, basically. Would there be a kind of censorship, or would it be considered taboo? Maybe
in Malta we have this idea that the Anneya, they used to be regarded as lower class people. You know, you wouldn't have a posh person doing Ana. Is it the same for Haufi? Was it just the low classes who used to do it, or everybody?
No, everybody would say it. So there's no problem. There's no problem of social standards, in fact.
Okay.
But insofar as the taboo
It's the same between cities and villages, countryside.
doesn't exist in the countryside. Only old cities. Old cities. And insofar as the taboos are concerned, in fact, it may go much deeper than this. I mean, we have, well, not really the Haufi, but the other varieties of Haufi, which are, for instance, I remember some Arabiyat from Morocco, for instance, which are really, really rude. I mean, it's incredible. Even talking about the mufti, the qadi, and harsdening them, I mean, it's incredible. The mouth of the woman, you can hardly...
Could it have been the only way these women could answer back? Could it have been the only way these women could be subversive?
Yes, definitely.
In their context?
Definitely. It's what I would define as the culture of the dominate. The way the dominate, handle their own domination. And the way they express themselves. They choose the way of expressing themselves.
It could be that there is free expression.
Yes, one can always dream. No, I don't think in a traditional society like ours,
Because in certain cultures, it could be subcultures, there would be no inhibitions. It's we, the polite people, so
I see.
called intellectuals, who say that's a rude word, that's an unused word. But in the real world, down to earth, any word is holy and it can be used freely. Even with the aneya, given the workers would have the routine and the boredom, and especially the woman washing clothes all the time, they had to break the boredom. So how would you break it? Like the blues with the slaves, They have the rhythms, the repetitions, so you let go of your kind of pain. But they had no inhibitions. So in my mind, that's why we consider them rude. Because at the time, if you are in the countryside or on city and you see a man, you want him. And you want to go forward. So I put it nicely. And otherwise you want to have him. Okay? That's my humble opinion. Freedom of expression when you have no inhibitions. Because you are taught to suppress. In that case, there is nothing to constrain you. I'm not saying the political situation. No. You're not aware of it. You're not aware of it, so you just do it.
Yeah. It's rather social censorship. You are pointing to a very sensible and very sensitive point in my personal research. I keep on asking my students, especially the young girls among them, to work on this wonderful thing. I mean, lullabies are something, it's a huge field, which is completely unexploited.
Yes, all this lullabies.
Yes, obviously, yes. And in fact, there has been some collects just recently, but it's just, a very small part of this huge repertoire, which is not only very poetical, but which for me is an insight to the traditional way of thinking of the women. Because obviously when they speak to their children or to their child, they're talking about, their personal problems. And as we say in Nigeria, I'm talking about myself. In fact, I'm talking about the label, you see. So that's exactly what happens in the lullaby. So yes, unfortunately, we have practically nothing. I'm really desperate about it, really, because
Now,
I do
for
agree.
example, here we have only one lullaby left. I don't know if there were more before.
one text? Or
No,
one
not
genre?
one text, one, two, one, two.
Oh, one tune.
Now,
Okay.
there are several
Okay.
quatrains to it, which are added on. Different people have different quatrains to the same level.
Okay.
But it seems to be very Christian. So I'm just wondering whether it has any similarities with a deeper.
Well, I happen to have a rapid look, unfortunately it was really rapid, through the collect made by my dear colleague Michel Gary, because he published some of the lullabies, if I don't remember well. And effectively there's some resemblances with what I know personally in my region. So far as the length of it is concerned, the introductory formula, which is concerned, the onomatopoeia is so it could be. Oh yes, definitely. I completely agree with you. Yes, that must be done according to me, because it must be parallelism with tradition, obviously. Although obviously, as you said, as you mentioned, the Maltese context, the dominant religion is important.
Yes,
So obviously,
Traditional culture was collected by just like il-qasam and the interesting thing about this collection is that at one point the speaker is speaking to the child, which is supposed to speak. But at another point along the sequence, she's addressing holy figures, saints, baby Jesus, and suddenly the Holy Family and her family merge. Suddenly, and it's baby Jesus who's answering, I can't sleep because of the nails in my hand. So there's this historic proto, this anachronism, which refers to the inevitable. And then later on in the same sequence, the same speaker addresses sleep itself as an abstract idea, which is allegorized as this person was being evoked to come quickly because she's losing her nerves. Right? the child. And there's this interesting blend of different addressees which come together in just this one very long sequence. I don't know if you're referring to the same word, one very long sequence, which touches on so many different aspects of the Maltese culture.
By the way, what about the evil eye?
As I was mentioning yesterday, for the versi tal-Qroqq and the Tal-Qroqq, and also their counterpart verses of implication, verses which actually curse something.
Oh, that's
and still we have mentions, for instance, the two fragments such as which is only a fragment of a longer piece, which he puts with the rest of these verses that exorcise evil from either one's house or one's person or one's belongings.
Because in the Maghreb lullabies we have many references to the evil eye. The mother is speaking to us always trying to protect a child against the evil eye of the enemies, the jealous.
In our lullabies, there is one interesting word that we can linguist point of view. The word the noun, which is nama, to sleep, but which doesn't exist anymore in Maltese. We say oral, which obviously yes, to lay down. So but it is used only just because of the sweetness of the sound, no? Nan. And it's used very often. It's mistaken with lamb.
It's used as a vowing sound.
What's that?
Okay.
Yes.
That's, I think, to come back to the musical point of view, I mean, yes, that's one of the main points as well. I mean, the melody of the lullabies is very, very important because we have always this type of very slow rhythm. It's very interesting.
Okay, so we've been together for 2 hours now. This is the end of the public talk by Mourad. Yes. But I suggest we have a break. For those of you who would like to stay on for the next 1 hour until 7:30, we'll be discussing the way this project can go forward. This project on It-Tradizzjoni Orali, coordinated by the Department of Maltese, but bringing together, as you have heard in the past half hour during our discussion, people with very, very different competences and different experiences coming together in the same room, ethnomusicologists, people from literature, people from language, people working from the point of view of folklore, working together to take this area of study forward. And also to propose. I mean, it's not only a question of documenting what we have, but it's also something Manuel likes to say a lot, sort of, what can we do even with this tradition to take it forward into the future? How we can revive, perhaps, in some way, certain things. So we have a 5-minute break now, but before the break, those of you who would like to stay, I hope many of you will stay for the second part till 7:30, and I'll keep the time, I assure you. But before we do so, on behalf of the Department of Maltese, I would like to thank
That's too kind.
Professor Yanes for his. He already knows a lot about Maltese culture and the Maltese language.
Oh, yes, sure. No, I don't. I'm going to learn.
He will know a bit more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
That's it.